Hi boys and girls, it's me Butch. My name is Terry David Silvercloud. I use all my names. I'm 73 years old. I have health problems, but I try to be useful each day. I live in chronic pain, so sitting down things are good for me. I'm a visual artist. I'm a painter in my old age and a very expert photographer. And I'm into theoretical physics at the subatomic level of reality. I have an excellent theory about how the electron, which is a particle, we know it repels itself, so that means it's a monopole, and because of that fact and its physical size, that it occupies space, it's a solid to us because of that fact, and we use it to measure just about everything, that the electron sets the speed of light, and it also powers the universe from within. It's always pushing things away from itself, and it'll never win, and that also causes gravity. Gravity is push, not pull. Time cannot speed up or slow down. Relative time, speeding up and slowing down, allowing for that. Einstein's big error was time is a measurement. When you alter your measurements, nothing works. What's happening is because the electrons are trying to get away from themselves. They're always trying to find rest, and they're trying to find the place with the least motion. And according to Einstein, the less motion, the slower time goes. Or sorry, time goes faster if time goes. Jeez, I see now I'm getting diverted. I have ADHD. Let's not get into that. I'm already up to minute 49 seconds. See? I try to be entertaining. I'm an artist, and I want to educate you a bit about the Jewish religion, and you need to know I'm an atheist. I'm inspired by Christopher Hitchens, who says we atheists should get up on our feet and destroy these superstitions and evils called religion. I despise all religions. I consider the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions to be particularly violent. They have a psychopathic God who will hurt people, destroy them, punish them. I'm into rehabilitation, not punishment, and if you believe in a God that'll hurt you, you're a perfect slave. You're a bit brainwashed, and I'm trying to help unbrainwash you. If you have a religion, you know nothing probably about where your religious texts came from. You don't read them. They're boring, right? I know they're boring because I've been reading them. They're really boring. But that's the only way you'll learn, and so I want to get on to, because I rant on and on and on, that's the way I am. I want to get on about history, and the thing about history is a lot of people get their history from Hollywood movies, which have nothing to do with real history. I'm going to be talking about Egypt, and a lot of people will associate the pyramids as being all part and parcel of Egypt, but that's not the case. The pyramids were built at least 1,000 years before the time of Moses, and 1,000 years is a really long time. If you consider 1,000 years ago from right now, what was going on about 1,200 years ago was there was a Viking prince named Rollo, and he had an older brother, and their dad died, and older brother inherited the family business, as it were, and advised Rollo that if he didn't want to join his father in the hereafter, he'd best take a hike. So Rollo packed up his goods and his warriors and stuff, and he sailed south, and he settled in an area of the lower Seine of France, in the area we now would call Normandy. So around that time, if I remember correctly, the king of northern France was a dude named Charles, and Charles heard that there were some Vikings that had set up camp down near the coast, and he just wanted to make sure he knew that they had to pay their taxes and who was the real boss around there. So he set off to have the Vikings, Rollo, pay homage to him, and really all Rollo had to do was kiss the king's foot and say, yeah, 3 bags full, we'll pay some taxes and go away. But Rollo, being a prince, he wasn't kissing anyone's foot, so he had one of his generals do it for him. And the story goes that the general was so ticked off he had to kiss anyone's foot. He lifted the king's foot up, and the king fell backwards on his rear end. And the king thought, well, at least they paid homage, and I don't want to mess with Vikings. They can be nasty, I've heard. all of that was like 1,000 years ago. So when and these guys, Rollo, his descendants, 100 years later or so, would cross the English Channel at what you'd know in 1066 as the Battle of Hastings, and they would become known as the Normans. So that's when the Norman invasion began of the British Isles. Other things you got to think about in history is that civilizations really began about 4,000 or longer BC, or whatever they call it these days. So there was the ancient city of Ur, and on the Indus River there were many quite advanced trading settlements, and they seemed to get along really well. The civilization developed because it was peaceful, and they were big on trading. And so we know that was happening, and there was Ur, and the Chinese were developing, but I'm not even going to worry about them. The point I'm trying to get through your heads here is history. You can't just compress it into a 90-minute movie and know your history. So I really want to talk about Moses. I'm going to get around to that in a meandering way. I'm up to 6 minutes already. You're going to be here for a few minutes if you want to learn something. If you really want to learn something, hang in there. I got lots to say. I'm a motor mouth. So I was trying to get you to get in your mind that Egyptian history went on for a long time. It was one of the first civilizations and began in the south of Egypt, in the area of Nubia, and then over time the kingdom moved north. A lot of that seemed to have to do with squabbles between the pharaohs and the priests and who was really in charge. And the reason the pyramids had such a short history as being tombs is that it wasn't very long after the old pharaohs were dead that the younger pharaoh said, I ain't letting that gold sit there. Get the gold. And if the pharaohs weren't and priests weren't stealing gold from tombs, everybody else was, and trying to figure out their way in. So as time went on, I've heard about the Valley of the Kings, and they just dug into sides of cliffs, and the pyramids are really ancient history, way before Moses. And I try to give you the 1,000-year idea to give you an idea that when Moses was alive, that was really ancient history. Also, we know from Egyptian history that there were dark ages where there were big fights. There were warlords for a period of perhaps a couple hundred years. And the Hyksos people, which would be in the area where Abraham would have come into, I'm going to talk about Abraham, that area was constantly being invaded by people moving inland, and as climate change was happening, we know Ur collapsed, and it definitely seemed to be everything to do with climate change. And when we read about Abraham, they talk about famines and that there was grain to be had in Egypt, so let's go to Egypt and buy grain. And we sort of began the early history of the Bible. Let's go to Abraham. Abraham was a pretty powerful dude, apparently, and who lived a long time, and he traveled a lot. He got around a lot of places. And we know that he visited a city called Salem. It's in Genesis. I had to make some notes there because I can't remember all this stuff. 14:18. Genesis 14:18, Abraham visits Salem, and the king of Salem was Melchizedek, and he was the high priest. So if Abraham wasn't into the one God thing, he definitely seemed to be after visiting Salem, and Melchizedek preached that there was only one God. And circumcision happened a long time ago. You'll see that in Genesis 17. And Abraham had a son, Ishmael, and the importance of Ishmael. See, I'm wondering. I don't know if I'm going to cover everything. I'm sure going to try. Ishmael, this is a Quran. I've tried to read the Quran. It's clear once you study Bibles that the Quran takes a lot of the ideas out of the book of Revelations and puts them on steroids. And the Prophet Muhammad, who is responsible for the ideas that got into the Quran, he was a trader and didn't get religion until he was in his 40s. But he'd been all over. He'd been to Egypt. He was well aware of other religions, and So what I'm going to talk about for a second here is Abraham, Ishmael, and the Kaaba. So in Genesis 21:19, that's where we'll be talking about Ishmael, Genesis 21:19. It's clear in the Bible, the Old Testament, that's where they talk about Ishmael discovering the oasis Zamzam, which is in where we would call Mecca today. And the Bible records that Abraham stayed a long time in that place. And I'm going to read you a couple of lines from the Quran. And this is the Quran in English puts the longest books first and the shortest books last. So if you were reading it not in English, you would start with the shortest book at the back and go forward. But we who speak English start at the front and go to the back. So the longest book, the Cow, is at the beginning of the English translations. And I'm going to read from the Cow, verse 127. Abraham and Ishmael built the house and dedicated it, saying, "Accept this from us, Lord. You are the one that hears all and knows all. Lord, make us submissive to you. Make of our descendants a community that will submit to you. Teach us our rites of worship and turn to us with mercy. You are the forgiving one, the merciful Lord. Send forth to them an apostle of their own, who shall declare to them your revelations, and shall instruct them in the book and in wisdom, and shall purify them of sin. You are the mighty, the wise one." So Muhammad would become that prophet who would instruct them in what would become Islam. And further on in the Quran, just to get the point of the first temple being the Kaaba in Mecca, which is a cube the same size as the Holy of Holies in the first and second temples of the Jews. You know that because you can read in the Bible, they were 30 cubits by 30 cubits by 30 cubits, which is 50 feet by 50 feet by 50 feet, which is about the size of the Kaaba. So the temple ever to be built for mankind was at Baka, a blessed site, a beacon for the nations. Now that might be because in the Kaaba in the southeast corner, if I remember correctly, is where there's a large, what is obviously a meteorite stone, and perhaps people thought the area was sacred because somehow they had found that meteor. Nobody knows where that meteorite came from, but it's very sacred to the people who follow Islam. Anyhow, Baka, a blessed site, a beacon for the nations. Inside of it, there are veritable signs, and the spot where Abraham stood. Whoever enters it is safe. It's a place of refuge. Pilgrimage to the house is a duty to God for all who can make the journey. As for the unbelievers, God can surely do without them. So that's why the people that follow Islam, they try to, once in their life, visit the Kaaba in Mecca, and they can buy bottled water from Zamzam, which is still there. And it's all built up now. But they have to walk around the Kaaba 7 times. And there's an old crow outside who's nesting. He wants me to give him a bit of food. So since I've known him since forever, he's been around since I've lived here for 8 years. I'll shut him up or he won't shut up. Where was I? The Kaaba. So Abraham was the father of the Hebrew people. And the Hebrew people widely settled in Egypt. We know that because the Egyptians were always getting uptight about all these people flooding in. And it's important to remember in a country like Egypt, most of the time it was an autocracy, and everybody worked for the Pharaoh. It didn't matter who you were. You didn't own anything. The Pharaoh owned everything, and you just worked and you got looked after in one way or another by the state pretty much. And there may have been private enterprise going on, there probably was, but you still worked for the state. You had to pay your dues. I've covered, Abraham, we know he visited Egypt, and what's interesting about Hebrew is Hebrew was one of the first written languages and one of the simplest. And I want to show you something about the word in Hebrew, amen. I'm going to use this from my, let me see if I can get you up here right. So I'm going to zero in on this image there. You can see on top is the Hebrew word amen, and below is the Egyptian hieroglyph for Ra said it, God said it. So if you look carefully at the lines of every letter, it might become really apparent to you that the Hebrew writing was probably developed as a kind of shorthand Egyptian. The Hebrew people are known for being particularly clever. We may not like that, but they seem to be. And that may be because if you're Orthodox Hebrew, there is no afterlife. When you're dead, you're dead. So this is it, and you better be making the most of it. And they're very good at passing on from father to son their lessons. Just look at Donald Trump. And it's part of, I learned a lot by working with a Jewish businessman. He was a pretty nasty guy in the way he treated people sometimes, but he was in it for the money. And so I learned a lot of what he was in about. Now I'm losing track here. The point is that, what I learned with him is that anything he said, don't believe anything. He would say anything to get the deal, and then he'd change it later. That's just, some Asians can be that way. It's just a really brutal way of doing business. You do whatever you can do to get the deal going, and this particular Jewish man had a broker's license, and he didn't really sell real estate, but he had a broker's license. And he used to take me to lunch all the time because he thought I was really smart and I was full of good ideas. I am really smart. And he said to me, why don't you get a real estate license? It's a license to print money. And I was not really doing anything but renovations for him and other odd jobs. And he paid for the course and loaned me $1,000 to buy some clothes. I had no suits or a car. I didn't have a car when I started real estate. But his number one thing with me was, and we didn't even have an office, get a signature on the agreement to sell it. Once you've got the listing, there's nothing they can do that won't cost them a fortune to get out of that contract. And we can deal with the details later, but get that effing signature. So that's how I know they're really sharp and they're just really tough business people and don't believe anything you hear. Just you be the same way. Just bully your way back. Bullies only respect bullies. So where was I? So the Egyptians may well have ordered the execution of firstborn males in the time of anywhere, in the time of Moses, because it's a fact that they were worried about. I had to swallow there. Overpopulation in what would be northern Egypt. So if at the time of Moses males were being killed, that's quite believable. It could have been going on. And it wouldn't be just the Hebrews who would be technically the slaves of the king or the pharaoh. Everybody pretty much would have been. So I want to, because I'm really getting on there and I still haven't covered my point, Moses, he was a Levite, or from a Levite mother, and that's important, but somewhere along the line he got religious and became aware of his own heritage, and even though he wasn't circumcised, which he was supposed to be, because God said that in Genesis 17 you got to be cut. That's the only way I'll know who's who, because God was a psychopath, and at least if you see if you're cut, I know that you're supposed to be with me. So if you're circumcised, and Islamic types and Jewish types are all cut. If they tell you your religion, you're 100% guaranteed the guy has been snipped. Where was I? That's just a fact I'm trying to teach you, if you don't already know. So Moses, at one time, even though he'd cut a deal with God, his wife was worried that God was going to kill him, and God even said, I might change my mind and kill you later. But she snipped off the foreskin of her son and smeared Moses, the son of the blood of her son, just so God, when God was on one of his rampages, wouldn't kill off Moses, who was supposed to be getting it all together. We also know that in the area of the time of Moses, from 1000 BC to 1500 BC, there were cataclysmic volcanic events in the Mediterranean. One that was so severe it seems to have wiped out the Minoan civilization, and would be an account of why there were so many people, they were always called sea people, moving inland. And it's quite possible at the time of Moses, one of those volcanoes was spewing smoke because they followed a pillar of smoke, as it were. That just might be oral tradition saying for direction we knew what direction we were going because we could see the volcano off. Even if we couldn't see the volcano, we could see the column of smoke rising in the air. So at some point, Moses decided to, because apparently he had killed somebody and was wanted by Pharaoh, whether that's true or not, who knows, who cares. He decided to lead the people out at some sort of advantageous time, which was probably when a volcano was about to explode, and the Red Sea probably receded, because when the earth is shifting around, sometimes the water does go back and then it comes back and there's a tsunami. So it may be that a bunch of Egyptians were caught up in a tsunami, and the tale just got entwined with the story of Moses. It's like with Jesus coming in at Easter on Passover and people throwing palm fronds in front of him. Palm fronds don't happen at that time of year. They happen in the fall. So it's highly probable that when Jesus entered the city, it was in the fall, and he was imprisoned over the winter and then crucified in the spring. But stories can change, and it's hard to interpret these old tales. Where was I? So Moses, he decides to hightail out. Oh, I was going to tell you a little story. Besides the earthquakes and lots of famine happening off and on, if volcanoes blew their lids, crops could fail for several years, and they might be able to stand a couple of years of crop failure, but 3, 4, 5, 6, that gets serious. And the first recorded workers' strike happened around 1050 or 1060, if I got my numbers right, BC. And the workers were paid in grain, and there wasn't none, and they went on strike, and that's of record. The Egyptians were good at keeping records when they weren't having their dark periods of war, and they don't mention Moses or any of that, or the Hebrews. But we have the Bible, and apparently the Hebrews developed a pretty good written language way back then, and were using it and writing things down, aside from oral tradition. So Moses, and this is the important part, he hightails it out of Egypt with his followers, and food falling out of the sky wouldn't be unusual if volcanoes were going off. Birds would be falling out of the sky. They'd be all over the place, dead birds. Lots of food there, but they were people who traditionally were wanderers, and they liked their milk and honey, which refers to the fact that they were goat herders and collectors of honey from wild bees. So they were used to that, and they lived off milk and honey. That was their prime diet. And they would want to go where they could find it. So they were pretty happy in the desert in some ways or other, except God had promised to give them the area that we would now think of probably as Israel. That it didn't matter who lived there. They weren't God's people, so it didn't really matter if you killed them off. And that was exactly what was going to happen under Joshua. Joshua was going to, after Moses, go into those areas, and it's celebrated in the Bible. We killed them, we killed them, we killed them. We're on God's side, so it's okay. It doesn't matter who you kill when you're on God's side. So Joshua would colonize the area in the area around modern Israel today after Moses. But Moses, the big point of my story, and I'm up to 24 minutes already, and I'm certainly not going off over half an hour, is that there came a time when Moses seemed to have realized that he really couldn't control this mob. There were no real laws, and so he seems to have come up with the idea of the Ten Commandments, and must have been in the area of a smoking volcano, because he went up into the clouds somewhere. He was on some sort of mountain that was clouded over, and he came back one day with the this particular story of the tablets. He comes down off the mountain. He's got the Ten Commandments on the stone, apparently. And the people are worshiping a golden calf, and he was like really ticked. Like, what the H is going on here? And apparently, his cohort Aaron, they just couldn't keep them under control, and they wanted a God they could see, and not some mysterious voice up in the bush and the flames of a volcano somewhere that's supposed to be God somehow. So at that point, this is the whole point of this long rant, actually. This is the mass murder. And I should read it to you just so you don't think I'm screwing with you. Where did I put that? Oh, here we go. So Moses came down off the mountain, and he's really ticked off, and this is what happens. My eyes aren't very good, but I'm going to give it my best. This is from Exodus 32:27. My eyes are so bad. I'm an artist, believe it or not. So then he said to... What he does, in case I don't read it here, is he gathers up the people of his tribe, which is a fairly smaller tribe, the Levites. He says, you guys are going to be the police, the teachers, the army. You guys are going to be in charge of everybody, and starting today. And this is what you're going to do. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man, he's telling his fellow Levites, each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Then Moses said, you have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day. So now you're a good, proper religious type. You don't care who you kill. You just do what God says. It doesn't matter whether it's your mother, son, brother, cousin. If you got religion, you're prepared to give them the old blade through the heart there, and sayonara, dude. So at that point, and this tradition would continue up to the time of King David. I got to really hurry here. There was a whole point, so I got that in, the mass murder, because I think I put that in the title. The Levites would be in charge, and they would not actually till the ground or do any of that kind of stuff, because they would become the judges, the police, in control of the militia. Each tribe would have to... They had their militia system, and the fittest of the young men would... You're going to do militia duty, and that's the way it is. You're going to do it, and that's that. And the Levites would be the militia of the militia. They would be the generals. They would be everything. They would also be the teachers and the keeper of the book and all that. Where was I? So that was the murder. And then after Moses died, Joshua began the colonization of the area around modern-day Israel, and it didn't matter who he wiped out. They were taking charge, and they did. And everything went peachy keen except the Philistines, which is the sea people, the people that kept coming in and trying to settle. We don't want them. Began to be a real nuisance, and we have the story of David and Goliath. And David, that's the other thing I want to tell you, we know he was a redhead, and the reason we know he was a redhead was when he was brought before the elders of the Levites. So he sent, I'm just going to read this one verse. So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, redhead is what that means, with a fine appearance and handsome features. So we know David was a carrot top. And so King David, he changed everything. He became a king, and then because there was blood on his hands, he was advised he couldn't build the temple, but his son Solomon would. And David was gay. His boyfriend was Jonathan. That's caused all this issue with Saul was the affair between his son Jonathan and David. They had a torrid affair going on, and nobody was too thrilled about that. And then eventually Jonathan and Saul accidentally got whacked. And then David, he lost his lover. But he had another boyfriend, the king of Tyre, and the king of Tyre helped him get materials together to build the future temple, particularly the wood they would need. They'd need lots of lumber for that sucker. And then, so the only real kingdom, Jewish kingdom that happened would have happened around the time of Saul. So I just wanted to check on something there. I wrote a book, The Shape of God. I had a Jewish history timeline in there. So that Jewish sort of kingdom only lasted 300 or 400 years, from around 1000 BC to around 700 BC, when the Persians came in and whacked the Jews and took them off into slavery and destroyed what they thought was the first temple, but was actually the second temple, because the first temple is still in Mecca. And then eventually the Persian Empire, through all war and all kinds of reasons, they didn't really have an issue with it. The Jews were the least of their worries, and Ezra went back to Jerusalem, which was originally the city of Salem. Remember Melchizedek? And started rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And then by the time of Jesus, Alexander the Great had come along. He really liked the Jews. And then when the Romans took over and made the area of Jerusalem the province of Judea, Herod really helped restore the temple, and because he knew he wanted to be on the good side of the locals, who were mainly Jewish, Hebrew, and it would be a really great tourist attraction to bring people in and money into the city. And what did he care, as long as they paid their taxes and kept the peace? So I've gone on, I said we'd go over 30 minutes, and I'm up to 32. So the main point of this was to give you an idea of Jewish history, and to get you to do your own research. You don't have to believe a single thing I said. It's all out there. All you got to do is get off your butt. I'm trying to encourage you to read your holy books and realize what a pile of crap they are. There might be some history in there, but there is no God. Get over it. Really. And Butchie Poo is going to say goodbye. Bye-bye. Now I got to click and shut you out of my life.